Have you ever had a moment where your entire future, everything you thought was real, shattered into a million pieces right in front of you? For me, it happened the night my fiancé told me to choose between her mother's approval and my own dignity. My name is Daniel, I'm 29, and my life used to be simple, predictable, and, frankly, fulfilling. I work as a lineman for the power company. That means I'm the guy climbing poles in storms, wrestling with live wires, sometimes getting called out at 3 a.m. because a tree took out half the grid. It's dangerous work, the kind where you don't get second chances, but it pays well enough that I own my truck outright, have zero debt, and was putting away decent money every month. I wasn't rich, not by any stretch, but I had a steady job that kept the lights on for thousands of people, quite literally. And I never, ever thought that was something to apologize for. My fiancée, Chloe, was incredible in so many ways. She was a graphic designer with real talent, the kind of person who could look at a blank screen and just create something beautiful. But there was this subtle crack running through her confidence, a fragility I didn't truly understand until I met her mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was one of those women who could smile while twisting the knife. Always perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and always ready with a comment that sounded like concern but landed like a punch. She had this insidious way of making Chloe second-guess everything, her career choices, her apartment, even the men she dated. And over the 2 years Chloe and I were together, I watched her shrink a little bit every time her mother called. The warning signs were there. I won't pretend they weren't. But I genuinely believed that love and firm boundaries would be enough. Chloe would hang up the phone and immediately start defending whatever Eleanor had just said, explaining that she's just worried, or she just wants the best, or she just has high standards. I learned to bite my tongue because pushing back only made Chloe defensive, putting me in the wrong. I vividly remember one call, about 3 months before Christmas. Eleanor spent 20 minutes questioning Chloe's career, calling graphic design a hobby, not a profession. After Chloe hung up, she spent the rest of the evening obsessively updating her portfolio, like she had something to prove, something to earn. I asked her why she let her mother get in her head like that. Chloe looked at me like I'd suggested she stop breathing. She said Eleanor had sacrificed everything to raise her and her brother, Michael, after their father left. The least Chloe could do was listen to her mother's advice. That should have been my sign to run. But I loved Chloe, or at least, I loved the version of her that existed when her phone wasn't ringing. About a week before Christmas, Chloe sat me down and gave me what I now realize was a preemptive warning she'd probably given to every guy before me. She told me her mother could be difficult, that she might ask personal questions, and I should just smile and not take anything personally. When I asked what kind of questions, Chloe looked away and just said, "Eleanor just likes to know who's in her daughter's life." I should have pressed harder, should have demanded to know what that really meant, but I was confident in who I was and what I did. I figured I could handle one dinner with a protective mother. Chloe even coached me on topics to avoid. She told me not to mention that I'd bought my truck used, or that I was still renting instead of owning. She said her mother had old-fashioned ideas about success, and it was easier to just avoid certain subjects. The fact that I needed a script for a family dinner should have told me everything, but I ignored it. Christmas Eve arrived. We drove to Eleanor's house in one of those perfectly manicured suburbs where every lawn looks like it was trimmed with scissors, and every car in the driveway cost more than I made in a year. Chloe was quiet the whole drive, gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles were white. When I asked if she was okay, she just said she was fine, but could I please just try to make a good impression? I told her I always made a good impression, which was true in every other context of my life. I just didn't realize I was walking into an ambush. Chloe's brother, Michael, was already there with his fiancée, Sarah. Michael was everything Eleanor wanted in a son. He worked in finance, wore suits that probably cost what I spent on groceries in a month, and had this effortless way of talking about money without ever actually saying numbers. Sarah gave me this incredibly sympathetic look when we were introduced. She actually pulled me aside while everyone was getting drinks and whispered, "Just agree with whatever Eleanor says. It's not worth fighting." I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but I thanked her anyway. Dinner started fine. Eleanor had gone all out with the decorations and the food. For the first hour, I actually thought maybe Chloe had been overthinking things. We talked about safe topics, the weather, the food, some story about a neighbor's Christmas lights. I started to relax. Eleanor even complimented my watch, which was nothing special but had been my grandfather's, and I foolishly thought maybe we were building some common ground. That was my mistake. Eleanor refilled her wine glass, then turned to me with that smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So, Daniel," she began, "what is it you do for work?" I told her I was a lineman. She tilted her head like she was trying to place the word, then asked if that was like a telephone repair person. I explained that I worked on power lines, the high-voltage transmission lines that kept electricity flowing to homes and businesses. Michael jumped in with some comment about how essential workers are the backbone of society, which should have been supportive, but it felt incredibly condescending, like he was patting a dog on the head. Eleanor nodded slowly before asking, "And how much does a job like that pay?" The table went quiet for half a second before everyone pretended that was a normal question to ask someone you just met. Chloe's hand tightened on my knee under the table, but I kept my voice steady. I said I made around $70,000 a year, which was honest and, frankly, nothing to be ashamed of. Eleanor made this little humming sound, the kind that wasn't quite agreement or disagreement, just acknowledgement. Then she asked if there was room for growth in that field. I explained that I could move into management eventually or specialize in different types of installations, but the pay was solid, the benefits were good, and, honestly, I liked the work. She nodded again, took another sip of wine, and then dropped the bomb. "It must be nice to have a simple job where you don't have to think too much." The table went completely silent. Chloe's grip on my knee went from a warning to sheer panic. Michael suddenly became very interested in his plate, and Sarah looked like she wanted to evaporate. I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my voice calm. "Eleanor," I said, "actually, the job requires constant problem-solving, deep technical knowledge, and incredibly quick thinking. One wrong move could kill me or knock out power for an entire county." Eleanor waved her hand like she was brushing away smoke. "Oh, I didn't mean it as an insult," she chirped. "Just that some people are built for physical work, and some people are built for careers that require real education and intellectual capacity." I mentioned that I had an associate's degree and multiple certifications that required years of intense training, but she'd already moved on. She pivoted. She asked about the ring, Chloe's engagement ring, and specifically asked how much I'd spent on it. Chloe tried to redirect, saying the ring was beautiful and that was all that mattered. But Eleanor talked right over her. "A ring is an investment in a woman's future, Daniel, a symbol of what a man can provide." I've always told Chloe never to settle for less than she deserves. The ring had cost me $4,000. That was a month's salary after taxes, and I'd saved for 6 months to buy it because I wanted Chloe to have something beautiful. I looked Eleanor dead in the eye. "That's a personal question, Eleanor. I'd rather not discuss finances at the dinner table." I was trying to be diplomatic. She laughed. "A man who's serious about providing for a family shouldn't be shy about discussing his financial capacity." Then she looked directly at me. "Chloe could have had her pick of men, Daniel. Men with real careers and real prospects. Doctors, lawyers, men like Michael. I just want to make sure I understand what she's marrying into." Chloe was raised with certain standards and expectations. Michael tried to change the subject, suggesting we move on to dessert, but I was done being polite. I looked Eleanor straight in the eye. "I understand exactly what I'm marrying into," I told her. "A woman I love, who deserves respect. And maybe if you spent less time measuring people by their bank accounts and more time recognizing that character and stability matter, you'd see that I'm exactly the kind of man Chloe needs." Eleanor's face went cold, like someone had flipped a switch. The pleasant hostess mask she'd been wearing just evaporated. She set down her wine glass very carefully and asked Chloe, "Are you going to let him disrespect your mother like that, in her own home?" Chloe looked between us, her face pale, her eyes wide. I could see the exact moment she made her choice. That second where she decided her mother's approval was worth more than my dignity. She turned to me, her voice shaking, but her words were clear. "Daniel, you need to apologize to my mother or leave." The words hung in the air. In that instant, I realized this wasn't about the dinner or the insults or even Eleanor. This was about every future holiday, every family gathering, every moment where I'd be expected to smile and take it while Eleanor picked me apart. And Chloe would stand by and let it happen, because that's what she'd been trained to do her entire life. I pushed back my chair, stood up, and simply said, "Okay." Chloe's eyes went wider, like she'd expected me to argue or grovel or cave the way she always did. But I just grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and walked toward the door. As I was leaving, I heard Michael say something under his breath that sounded like, "Finally." And when I glanced back, Sarah was staring at Chloe with this look of profound disappointment that told me this wasn't the first time this had happened. I heard Chloe calling my name as I reached my truck, her voice getting higher and more desperate. But I didn't stop. I started the engine and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the driveway, in the cold, without a jacket. And I felt nothing but clarity. That was the moment I realized who she would choose when it mattered. And it wasn't me. I drove home in complete silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the roar of my truck on the highway and my own thoughts getting louder with every mile. By the time I pulled into our apartment complex, my phone had 17 missed calls from Chloe and a string of texts that started with apologies and ended with accusations. The first few messages were panicked, asking where I was, saying we needed to talk. Then they shifted to defensive, saying I'd embarrassed her in front of her family and that I knew how her mother could be. Finally, they landed on angry, telling me I was being dramatic and that if I'd just kept my mouth shut for one dinner, none of this would have happened. I read every single one, sitting in my truck in the parking lot. And that's when it clicked. She wasn't sorry for what happened. She was sorry I hadn't played along. The apartment felt different when I walked in, like I was seeing it clearly for the first time. And I realized how much of myself I'd been folding up, bending, to fit into Chloe's life. I sat on the couch and just stared at the walls. That's when I noticed Chloe's laptop was open on the coffee table, still logged into her email. I wasn't planning to snoop, but the screen was facing me, and I saw a message from Eleanor with the subject line, Daniel. My stomach dropped. I shouldn't have clicked it. But I did. The email chain went back months, and what I read made everything make sense in the most devastating way possible. Eleanor had been sending Chloe regular emails about me, detailed lists of my inadequacies, comparisons to other men Chloe could have dated, links to articles about financial planning and the importance of marrying within your social class. But what truly destroyed me were Chloe's responses. She wasn't defending me. She was agreeing with her mother, saying she had concerns too, but that I was nice enough, and she hoped she could encourage me to be more ambitious, that maybe, after the wedding, she could push me toward a better career. There was one email from 2 months ago where Eleanor asked point-blank if Chloe was sure about marrying him, or if she was just settling because she was getting older and felt pressure. Chloe's response? That she loved me, but she understood Eleanor's concerns, and that she was hoping I'd grow into the kind of provider she needed. I sat there reading those emails, and I felt like I was watching our entire relationship rewrite itself in real time. Every time Chloe had defended her mother's comments, every time she'd made excuses for Eleanor's behavior, it wasn't because she was conflict avoidant. It was because she agreed with her mother. I was a project to her, someone she was trying to fix. And the worst part was realizing that she'd never seen me as enough. Chloe called again around midnight, and this time I answered. She was staying at Michael's place, and her voice had that tight, controlled quality that meant she'd been crying, but didn't want me to know. She said she needed space to think, that I'd put her in an impossible position, and that maybe in a few days, when we both calmed down, we could talk about this like adults. I asked her if she'd been emailing her mother about me behind my back. The silence on the other end told me everything. She started to stammer, asking how I knew about that. I told her I'd seen the emails. All of them. She tried to explain, said it wasn't what it looked like, that she was just venting to her mother, that everyone complains about their partners sometimes. I asked her if everyone tells their mother they're hoping their partner will become a different person after the wedding. She went quiet. Then she said that I was taking things out of context, that I was invading her privacy, and that if I loved her, I'd understand that she was just working through her feelings. I told her I did understand. I understood that she'd never actually wanted to marry me. She'd wanted to marry the version of me she thought she could create. And I was done being a project. She started to argue, started to cry, but I hung up. 3 days of silence followed, and I spent every one of them planning my exit. I thought about proposing to Chloe, how I'd spent weeks planning the perfect moment. I took her to the beach at sunset, got down on one knee in the sand, and she'd cried and said yes. Now I realized she'd probably been imagining her mother's reaction the whole time, calculating whether I was acceptable enough. I called my buddy, Thomas, who owned a moving company, and told him I needed help with something, and I'd pay him double if he could come first thing in the morning. He showed up at dawn with his truck. I had a system. Anything I'd paid for was mine. Anything that was clearly hers stayed. The couch I'd saved up for. The TV I'd bought for football Sundays. The coffee maker, the gaming console, the kitchen table I'd refinished myself. All of it went into Thomas's truck. I left her clothes, her art supplies, her laptop, all the designer bags and shoes. But I took back everything I'd contributed. The engagement ring was sitting in a dish on the dresser. I pocketed it because that ring represented a future that was never real. While I was packing up my tools from the closet, I found a folder tucked behind some of Chloe's old portfolios. Curiosity, a powerful and dangerous thing, got the better of me. Inside were printed copies of the emails I'd seen, plus others I hadn't, including one where Eleanor had offered to pay for Chloe's wedding to someone else if she'd break up with me before the engagement. Chloe had declined, but her response wasn't that she loved me too much to leave. It was that she'd already invested too much time in the relationship and wanted to see if I'd improve. I took photos of those emails with my phone, not because I wanted to use them maliciously, but because I knew Chloe would try to gaslight me later, and I wanted undeniable proof of what I'd seen. Thomas helped me move everything to my new apartment in one trip. As we were unloading, he asked what happened. I told him about the emails. He let out a long whistle. "You dodged a bullet, man," he said. "A woman who talks about you like that to her mother will never truly respect you." The new place was smaller, quieter, and mine. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. On the third day, I sent Chloe a single text telling her she could go back to the apartment whenever she wanted, and I'd left my key in the mailbox. She responded an hour later with a wall of text, and I didn't read most of it. She called 6 times. On the 7th call, I answered. I told her I'd taken what was mine, that I was off the lease, and that I'd found the printed emails in the closet. She went silent, then started crying, saying I didn't understand, that she'd never meant for me to see those, that she was just confused and working through her feelings with her mother. I told her that the problem wasn't that I'd seen them. It was that she'd written them. And that I finally understood I was never going to be enough for her because she didn't actually want me. She wanted someone else wearing my face. She demanded the ring back. I told her no. That when she chose her mother over me at that dinner table, she gave up any claim to it. There was a long silence, and then she said I was cruel, that she'd thought I just needed to cool off. I told her that was the problem. She'd expected me to come crawling back, like every other time she or her mother had criticized me. But she'd finally pushed too far. I told her to have a good life and hung up. 2 weeks later, Chloe went back to the apartment and saw what I'd done. My phone exploded with messages, but I'd already blocked her number. She tried reaching out through friends. I sent one group text with screenshots of the emails to everyone who'd contacted me. No commentary, just the proof. The messages stopped after that. Some decisions feel sudden, but they're really the result of 1,000 small compromises that finally hit their breaking point. That Christmas dinner wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the moment I finally admitted what I'd been ignoring, that Chloe had never actually loved me. She'd loved the idea of fixing me. The fallout from the emails was swift and brutal, at least for Chloe. When I sent those screenshots to the mutual friends who'd been pressuring me to take her back, the narrative changed overnight. People started reaching out to apologize, saying they hadn't known the full story. And a few admitted they'd always thought Chloe seemed calculating, but hadn't wanted to say anything. One friend told me that Michael had actually called him and said he was glad I'd left, that he'd watched Chloe do this to 2 other guys before me, and he was tired of watching his sister treat people like audition pieces for her perfect life. Apparently, Sarah had refused to be in the wedding party because she didn't think Chloe was marrying me for the right reasons. That sympathetic look she'd given me at dinner suddenly made a lot more sense. Work became my sanctuary. 3 months after the breakup, I got promoted to crew lead. The validation felt incredible. Not just because of the money, though that certainly helped, but because it proved that I was good at what I did, that my worth wasn't determined by Eleanor's standards or Chloe's secret shame. I moved into a better apartment with a balcony where I could watch the sunrise with my coffee, and every single thing in it was something I'd chosen. 6 months out, I started dating again. I met Mia at a friend's barbecue. She was a teacher, funny, genuine, with this incredible ease about her that came from actually liking herself. When I told her what I did, she asked real questions. She wanted to know about the technical side, the danger. And when I mentioned the breakup in passing, she said, anyone who needs their parents' approval to love someone isn't ready to be married. That's when I knew she was different. Christmas came around again, and Mia invited me to her parents' place. I was nervous, but her dad, Robert, was a retired mechanic who genuinely asked about my truck. Her mom, Susan, was a nurse who made fun of both of us for talking about engines during dinner. When Robert asked about my job, really asked, and I explained the technical work we did, he just said, "That's good work, important work." And I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. No qualifiers, no comparisons. Just respect. Life settled into something sustainable. Work, Mia, beers with Thomas on Fridays, and blessedly, no drama. Then, 13 months after that Christmas dinner, Chloe showed up at my door on a Tuesday night. She looked smaller than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. She asked if we could talk. I stepped outside and closed the door. She started talking fast, rehearsed, telling me she'd cut Eleanor off, that she'd been in therapy, that she'd changed, and realized she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. She said if I'd give her another chance, she'd prove things could be different. I listened to all of it, and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. Just certainty that this chapter was absolutely closed. I told her I was glad she was working on herself, but it didn't change anything for us. She started crying, asking what she could do, and I realized she still didn't understand. This wasn't about her mother anymore. It was about the emails. It was about the fact that she'd spent 2 years seeing me as a project, someone she was trying to fix into being acceptable. She asked if there was someone else, and I told her yes. Someone who'd respected me from day one. Chloe's face crumpled, and she asked if I'd ever really loved her. I told her I'd loved the version of her I thought existed. But that person was never real. She begged, literally begged, said she'd do anything. I thought about Robert saying, "That's good work." About my balcony mornings. About the peace I'd built. And I said no. She stood there crying, then said I was making a mistake, that I'd regret this. I told her I wouldn't. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She said Michael had told her she was an idiot, that he'd tried to warn her I was the best thing that ever happened to her, and that Eleanor had already ruined 2 of Chloe's relationships before mine. She said Michael had actually apologized to Sarah on her behalf after that dinner, and that Sarah had told him if he didn't stand up to his mother, their engagement was over. Apparently, Michael had finally confronted Eleanor, told her she'd destroyed Chloe's chance at happiness. And Eleanor, of course, had blamed me, said I'd turned both her children against her. Chloe said she'd lost everything, her mother, her brother's respect, most of her friends, after the emails got around. She'd moved back home only to realize Eleanor was never going to change. She'd spent a year in therapy undoing the damage, and she just wanted me to know she finally understood what I'd been trying to tell her. I told her I appreciated her saying that, but it didn't change my answer. She asked about the ring one more time, said it would help her move on, to let go of that last piece. I told her I'd sold it, which was partly true. I'd actually donated it to a charity auction for first responders. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and said she hoped I was happy. I told her I was. And I meant it. She left, and I went back inside to find Mia making tea. She handed me a mug and said she was there if I wanted to talk. I kissed her and said I was good. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Eleanor had shown up at Michael's house demanding to see Chloe. Michael had told her Chloe had moved to another state and didn't want contact. Apparently, Eleanor tried to blame the whole thing on me, said I'd poisoned her children against her, and Michael had finally told her the truth, that she'd spent years tearing Chloe down, and he was done watching it happen. Sarah had backed him up, and they'd gone no contact with Eleanor entirely. The last I heard, Chloe was doing okay, working as a designer in Portland. She'd started posting on social media again, but this time it was just her work. No quotes about relationships or betrayal, just art. I hoped she'd found some peace. As for me, I had everything I needed. The truth is, some decisions feel sudden, but they're really the result of 1,000 small compromises that finally hit their breaking point. And that Christmas dinner, it wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the moment I finally admitted what I'd been ignoring, that Chloe had never actually loved me. She'd loved the idea of fixing me. Walking away wasn't about punishment. It was about choosing myself, about refusing to spend my life trying to measure up to someone else's arbitrary standards. The day I walked out of Eleanor's house, I chose my own worth over someone else's approval. And I'd make that same choice every single time. Because the life you build trying to please people who will never be satisfied isn't a life worth living. What do you think about this whole situation? If you were in my shoes, would you have done the same? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective.